Story 13, Part 2 of the Best American Humorous Short Stories by Alexander Jessup, Editor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 13, Colonel Starbottle for the Plaintiff, 1901, Part 2 by Bret Harte. For all that, wild horses could not have torn from the Colonel a word about Hotchkiss's anger. He expressed his intention of employing counsel and defending a suit, returned the Colonel, affably basking in her smile. She dragged her chair nearer his desk. "Then you'll fight him tooth and nail?" she said eagerly. "You'll show him up? You'll tell the whole story your own way? You'll give him fits? And you'll make him pay? Sure?" she went on breathlessly. "I will," said the Colonel, almost as breathlessly. She caught his fat white hand, which was lying on the table, between her own and lifted it to her lips. He felt her soft young fingers even through the lisle thread gloves that encased them, and the warm moisture of her lips upon his skin. He felt himself flushing, but was unable to break the silence or change his position. The next moment she had scuttled back with her chair to her old position. "I certainly shall do my best," stammered the Colonel, in an attempt to recover his dignity and composure. "That's enough. You'll do it," said the girl, enthusiastically. "Lordy, just you talk for me as you did for his old ditch company, and you'll fetch it every time. Why, when you made that jury sit up the other day, when you got that off about the 'Mericun flag waving equally over the rights of honest citizens banded together in peaceful commercial pursuits, as well as over the fortress of official oligarchy," murmured the Colonel, courteously. "Oligarchy," repeated the girl, quickly. "My breath was just took away. I said to Ma, 'Ain't he too sweet for anything?' I did, honest Injun. And when you rolled it all off at the end, never missing a word, you didn't need to mark 'em in a lesson book, but had 'em all ready on your tongue, and walked out—well, I didn't know you nor the ditch company from Adam, but I could have just run over and kissed you there before the whole court." She laughed with her face glowing, although her strange eyes were cast down. Alack, the Colonel's face was equally flushed, and his own beady eyes were on his desk. To any other woman he would have voiced the banal gallantry that he should now, himself, look forward to that reward, but the words never reached his lips. He laughed, coughed slightly, and when he looked up again she had fallen into the same attitude as on her first visit, with her parasol point on the floor. "I must ask you to direct your memory to 'nother point. The breaking off of the engagement. Did he give any reason for it, or show any cause?" "No, he never said anything," returned the girl. "Not in his usual way? No reproaches out of the hymn book or the sacred writings?" "No, he just quit." "Ceased his attentions," said the Colonel, gravely. "And naturally you were not conscious of any cause for his doing so?" The girl raised her wonderful eyes so suddenly and so penetratingly, without reply in any other way, that the Colonel could only hurriedly say, "I see. None, of course." At which she rose, the Colonel rising also. "We shall begin proceedings at once. I must, however, caution you to answer no questions nor say anything about this case to any one until you are in court." She answered his request with another intelligent look and a nod. He accompanied her to the door. As he took her proffered hand, he raised the lisle thread fingers to his lips with old-fashioned gallantry. As if that act had condoned for his first omissions and awkwardness, he became his old-fashioned self again, buttoned his coat, pulled out his shirt frill, and strutted back to his desk. A day or two later it was known throughout the town that Zaidee Hooker had sued Adoniram Hotchkiss for breach of promise, and that the damages were laid at $5,000. As in those bucolic days the Western press was under the secure censorship of a revolver, a cautious tone of criticism prevailed, and any gossip was confined to personal expression, and even then at the risk of the gossiper. Nevertheless, the situation provoked the intensest curiosity. The Colonel was approached, until his statement that he should consider any attempt to overcome his professional secrecy a personal reflection withheld further advances. The community were left to the more ostentatious information of the defendant's counsel, Messrs. Kitchem and Bilzer, that the case was ridiculous and rotten, that the plaintiff would be non-suited, and the fire-eating Starbottle would be taught a lesson that he could not bully the law, and there were some dark hints of a conspiracy. It was even hinted that the case was the revengeful and preposterous outcome of the refusal of Hotchkiss to pay Starbottle an extravagant fee for his late services to the Ditch Company. It is unnecessary to say that these words were not reported to the Colonel. It was, however, an unfortunate circumstance for the calmer, ethical consideration of the subject that the Church sided with Hotchkiss, as this provoked an equal adherence to the plaintiff and Starbottle on the part of the larger body of non-church goers, who were delighted at a possible exposure of the weakness of religious rectitude. "I've allus had my suspicions of them early candlelight meetin's down at that gospel shop," said one critic, "and I reckon Deacon Hotchkiss don't rope in the gals to attend jest for psalm singing." "Then for him to get up and leave the board before the games have finished, and try to sneak out of it," said another. "I suppose that's what they call religious." It was, therefore, not remarkable that the courthouse 3 weeks later was crowded with an excited multitude of the curious and sympathizing. The fair plaintiff, with her mother, was early in attendance, and under the Colonel's advice appeared in the same modest garb in which she had first visited his office. This, and her downcast, modest demeanor, were perhaps at first disappointing to the crowd, who had evidently expected a paragon of loveliness, as the Circe of the grim ascetic defendant, who sat beside his counsel. But presently all eyes were fixed on the Colonel, who certainly made up in his appearance any deficiency in his fair client. His portly figure was clothed in a blue dress coat with brass buttons, a buff waistcoat which permitted his frilled shirt front to become erectile above it, a black satin stock which confined a boyish turned-down collar around his full neck, and immaculate drill trousers strapped over varnished boots. A murmur ran around the court. "Old Personally Responsible had got his war paint on." "The old war horse is smelling powder," were whispered comments. Yet for all that, the most irreverent among them recognized vaguely in this bizarre figure something of an honored past in their country's history, and possibly felt the spell of old deeds and old names that had once thrilled their boyish pulses. The new district judge returned Colonel Starbottle's profoundly punctilious bow. The Colonel was followed by his negro servant, carrying a parcel of hymn books and Bibles, who, with a courtesy evidently imitated from his master, placed one before the opposite counsel. This, after a first curious glance, the lawyer somewhat superciliously tossed aside. But when Jim, proceeding to the jury box, placed with equal politeness the remaining copies before the jury, the opposite counsel sprang to his feet. "I want to direct the attention of the court to this unprecedented tampering with the jury by this gratuitous exhibition of matter impertinent and irrelevant to the issue." The judge cast an inquiring look at Colonel Starbottle. "May it please the court," returned Colonel Starbottle with dignity, ignoring the counsel, "the defendant's counsel will observe that he is already furnished with the matter, which I regret to say he has treated, in the presence of the court and of his client, a deacon of the church, with great superciliousness. When I state to your honor that the books in question are hymn books and copies of the Holy Scriptures, and that they are for the instruction of the jury, to whom I shall have to refer them in the course of my opening, I believe I am within my rights." "The act is certainly unprecedented," said the judge dryly, "but unless the counsel for the plaintiff expects the jury to sing from these hymn books, their introduction is not improper, and I cannot admit the objection. As defendant's counsel are furnished with copies also, they cannot plead surprise, as in the introduction of new matter, and as plaintiff's counsel relies evidently upon the jury's attention to his opening, he would not be the first person to distract it." After a pause, he added, addressing the colonel, who remained standing, "The court is with you, sir. Proceed." But the colonel remained motionless and statuesque, with folded arms. "I have overruled the objection," repeated the judge. "You may go on." "I am waiting, your honor, for the withdrawal by the defendant's counsel of the word tampering, as refers to myself, and of impertinent, as refers to the sacred volumes." "The request is a proper one, and I have no doubt will be acceded to," returned the judge quietly. The defendant's counsel rose and mumbled a few words of apology, and the incident closed. There was, however, a general feeling that the colonel had in some way scored, and if his object had been to excite the greatest curiosity about the books, he had made his point. But impassive of his victory, he inflated his chest with his right hand in the breast of his buttoned coat, and began. His usual high color had paled slightly, but the small pupils of his prominent eyes glittered like steel. The young girl leaned forward in her chair with an attention so breathless, a sympathy so quick, and an admiration so artless and unconscious, that in an instant she divided with the speaker the attention of the whole assemblage. It was very hot. The court was crowded to suffocation. Even the open windows revealed a crowd of faces outside the building, eagerly following the colonel's words. He would remind the jury that only a few weeks ago he stood there as the advocate of a powerful company, then represented by the present defendant. He spoke then as the champion of strict justice against legal oppression. No less should he today champion the cause of the unprotected and the comparatively defenseless, save for that paramount power which surrounds beauty and innocence, even though the plaintiff of yesterday was the defendant of today. As he approached the court a moment ago, he had raised his eyes and beheld the starry flag flying from its dome, and he knew that glorious banner was a symbol of the perfect equality under the Constitution of the rich and the poor, the strong and the weak, an equality which made the simple citizen taken from the plough in the veld, the pick in the gulch, or from behind the counter in the mining town, who served on that jury, the equal arbiters of justice with that highest legal luminary whom they were proud to welcome on the bench today. The colonel paused, with a stately bow to the impassive judge. It was this, he continued, which lifted his heart as he approached the building. And yet he had entered it with an uncertain, he might almost say, a timid step. And why? He knew, gentlemen, he was about to confront a profound, aye, a sacred responsibility. Those hymn books and holy writings handed to the jury were not, as his honor surmised, for the purpose of enabling the jury to indulge in a preliminary choral exercise. He might indeed say, alas not. They were the damning, incontrovertible proofs of the perfidy of the defendant, and they would prove as terrible a warning to him as the fatal characters upon Belshazzar's wall. There was a strong sensation. Hotchkiss turned a sallow green. His lawyers assumed a careless smile. It was his duty to tell them that this was not one of those ordinary breach of promise cases which were too often the occasion of ruthless mirth and indecent levity in the courtroom. The jury would find nothing of that here. There were no love letters with the epithets of endearment, nor those mystic crosses and ciphers which, he had been credibly informed, chastely hid the exchange of those mutual caresses known as kisses. There was no cruel tearing of the veil from those sacred privacies of the human affection. There was no forensic shouting out of those fond confidences meant only for one. But there was, he was shocked to say, a new sacrilegious intrusion. The weak pipings of Cupid were mingled with the chorus of the saints. The sanctity of the temple, known as the meeting house, was desecrated by proceedings more in keeping with the shrine of Venus, and the inspired writings themselves were used as the medium of amatory and wanton flirtation by the defendant in his sacred capacity as deacon. The Colonel artistically paused after this thunderous denunciation. The jury turned eagerly to the leaves of the hymn books, but the larger gaze of the audience remained fixed upon the speaker and the girl, who sat in rapt admiration of his periods. After the hush, the Colonel continued in a lower and sadder voice. "There are perhaps few of us here, gentlemen, with the exception of the defendant, who can arrogate to themselves the title of regular church-goers, or to whom these humbler functions of the prayer meeting, the Sunday school, and the Bible class are habitually familiar. Yet, more solemnly, down in your hearts is the deep conviction of our shortcomings and failings, and a laudable desire that others at least should profit by the teachings we neglect. Perhaps," he continued, closing his eyes dreamily, "there is not a man here who does not recall the happy days of his boyhood, the rustic village spire, the lessons shared with some artless village maiden, with whom he later sauntered hand in hand through the woods, as the simple rhyme rose upon their lips, 'Always make it a point to have it a rule, never to be late at the Sabbath school.' He would recall the strawberry feasts, the welcome annual picnic, redolent with hunks of gingerbread and sarsaparilla. How would they feel to know that these sacred recollections were now forever profaned in their memory by the knowledge that the defendant was capable of using such occasions to make love to the larger girls and teachers, whilst his artless companions were innocently, the court will pardon me for introducing what I am credibly informed is the local expression, doing gooseberry?" The tremulous flicker of a smile passed over the faces of the listening crowd, and the Colonel slightly winced. But he recovered himself instantly, and continued. "My client, the only daughter of a widowed mother, who has for years stemmed the varying tides of adversity in the western precincts of this town, stands before you to-day invested only in her own innocence. She wears no rich gifts of her faithless admirer, is panoplied in no jewels, rings, nor mementos of affection, such as lovers delight to hang upon the shrine of their affections. Hers is not the glory with which Solomon decorated the Queen of Sheba, though the defendant, as I shall show later, clothed her in the less expensive flowers of the king's poetry. No, gentlemen, the defendant exhibited in this affair a certain frugality of pecuniary investment, which I am willing to admit may be commendable in his class. His only gift was characteristic alike of his methods and his economy. There is, I understand, a certain not unimportant feature of religious exercise known as taking a collection. The defendant on this occasion, by the mute presentation of a tip plate covered with baize, solicited the pecuniary contributions of the faithful. On approaching the plaintiff, however, he himself slipped a love token upon the plate and pushed it towards her. That love token was a lozenge, a small disc, I have reason to believe, concocted of peppermint and sugar, bearing upon its reverse surface the simple words, "I love you." I have since ascertained that these discs may be bought for 5 cents a dozen, or at considerably less than 1/2 cent for the single lozenge. Yes, gentlemen, the words "I love you," the oldest legend of all, the refrain when the morning stars sang together, were presented to the plaintiff by a medium so insignificant that there is, happily, no coin in the Republic low enough to represent its value. "I shall prove to you, gentlemen of the jury," said the Colonel solemnly, drawing a Bible from his coat tail pocket, "that the defendant, for the last 12 months, conducted an amatory correspondence with the plaintiff by means of underlined words of sacred writ and church psalmody, such as 'beloved,' 'precious,' and 'dearest,' occasionally appropriating whole passages which seemed apposite to his tender passion. I shall call your attention to one of them. The defendant, while professing to be a total abstainer, a man who in my own knowledge has refused spirituous refreshment as an inordinate weakness of the flesh, with shameless hypocrisy underscores with his pencil the following passage and presents it to the plaintiff. The gentlemen of the jury will find it in the Song of Solomon, page 548, chapter 2, verse 5. After a pause, in which the rapid rustling of leaves was heard in the jury box, Colonel Starbottle declaimed in a pleading stentorian voice, "Stay with me, flagons, comfort me with apples, for I am sick of love." Yes, gentlemen, yes, you may well turn from those accusing pages and look at the double-faced defendant. He desires to be stayed with flagons. I am not aware at present what kind of liquor is habitually dispensed at these meetings, and for which the defendant so urgently clamored, but it will be my duty before this trial is over to discover it, if I have to summon every barkeeper in this district. For the moment I will simply call your attention to the quantity. It is not a single drink that the defendant asks for, not a glass of light and generous wine, to be shared with his inamorata, but a number of flagons or vessels, each possibly holding a pint measure for himself. The smile of the audience had become a laugh. The judge looked up warningly, when his eye caught the fact that the Colonel had again winced at this mirth. He regarded him seriously. Mr. Hotchkiss's counsel had joined in the laugh affectedly, but Hotchkiss himself was ashy pale. There was also a commotion in the jury box, a hurried turning over of leaves, and an excited discussion. "The gentlemen of the jury," said the judge with official gravity, "will please keep order, and attend only to the speeches of counsel. Any discussion here is irregular and premature, and must be reserved for the jury room after they have retired." The foreman of the jury struggled to his feet. He was a powerful man with a good-humored face, and, in spite of his infelicitous nickname of the Bone Breaker, had a kindly, simple, but somewhat emotional nature. Nevertheless, it appeared as if he were laboring under some powerful indignation. "Can we ask a question, Judge?" he said respectfully, although his voice had the unmistakable Western American ring in it, as of one who was unconscious that he could be addressing any but his peers. "Yes," said the judge good-humoredly. "We're finding in this yer piece, out of which the Colonel has just been a-quoting, some language that me and my partners allow ain't oughter to be read out afore a young lady in court,
and we want to know of you, as a fair-minded and impartial man, ef this is the reg'lar kind of book given to gals and babies down at the meetin' house." "The jury will please follow the counsel's speech without comment," said the Judge, briefly, fully aware that the defendant's counsel would spring to his feet, as he did promptly. "The court will allow us to explain to the gentlemen that the language they seem to object to has been accepted by the best theologians for the last 1,000 years as being purely mystic. As I will explain later, those are merely symbols of the Church." "Of what?" interrupted the foreman, in deep scorn. "Of the Church." "We ain't asking any questions of you, and we ain't taking any answers," said the foreman, sitting down promptly. "I must insist," said the Judge, sternly, "that the plaintiff's counsel be allowed to continue his opening without interruption. You," to defendant's counsel, "will have your opportunity to reply later." The counsel sank down in his seat with the bitter conviction that the jury was manifestly against him, and the case as good as lost. But his face was scarcely as disturbed as his client's, who, in great agitation, had begun to argue with him wildly, and was apparently pressing some point against the lawyer's vehement opposal. The Colonel's murky eyes brightened as he still stood erect with his hand thrust in his breast. "It will be put to you, gentlemen, when the counsel on the other side refrains from mere interruption and confines himself to reply, that my unfortunate client has no action, no remedy in law, because there were no spoken words of endearment. But, gentlemen, it will depend upon you to say what are and what are not articulate expressions of love. We all know that among the lower animals, with whom you may possibly be called upon to classify the defendant, there are certain signals more or less harmonious, as the case may be. The ass brays, the horse neighs, the sheep bleats, the feathered denizens of the grove call to their mates in more musical roundelays. These are recognized facts, gentlemen, which you yourselves, as dwellers among nature in this beautiful land, are all cognizant of. They are facts that no one would deny. And we should have a poor opinion of the ass who, at such a supreme moment, would attempt to suggest that his call was unthinking and without significance. But, gentlemen, I shall prove to you that such was the foolish, self-convicting custom of the defendant. With the greatest reluctance and the greatest pain, I succeed in wresting from the maidenly modesty of my fair client the innocent confession that the defendant had induced her to correspond with him in these methods. Picture to yourself, gentlemen, the lonely, moonlit road beside the widow's humble cottage. It is a beautiful night, sanctified to the affections, and the innocent girl is leaning from her casement. Presently there appears upon the road a slinking, stealthy figure, the defendant, on his way to church. True to the instruction she has received from him, her lips part in the musical utterance— the Colonel lowered his voice in a faint falsetto, presumably in fond imitation of his fair client— "Kyrie!" Instantly the night becomes resonant with the impassioned reply. The Colonel here lifted his voice in stentorious tones— "Kero!" Again, as he passes, arises the soft "Kyrie!" Again, as his form is lost in the distance, comes back the deep "Kero!" A burst of laughter, long, loud, and irrepressible, struck the whole courtroom. And before the Judge could lift his half-composed face and take his handkerchief from his mouth, a faint "Kyrie!" from some unrecognized obscurity of the courtroom was followed by a loud "Kero!" from some opposite locality. "The sheriff will clear the court," said the Judge sternly. But alas, as the embarrassed and choking officials rushed hither and thither,
A soft "Kerree" from the spectators at the window outside the courthouse was answered by a loud chorus of "Kerrows" from the opposite windows, filled with onlookers. Again the laughter arose everywhere. Even the fair plaintiff herself sat convulsed behind her handkerchief. The figure of Colonel Starbottle alone remained erect, white and rigid. And then the judge, looking up, saw what no one else in the court had seen, that the Colonel was sincere and in earnest, that what he had conceived to be the pleader's most perfect acting and most elaborate irony were the deep, serious, mirthless convictions of a man without the least sense of humor. There was a touch of this respect in the judge's voice as he said to him gently, "You may proceed, Colonel Starbottle." "I thank your honor," said the Colonel slowly, "for recognizing and doing all in your power to prevent an interruption that during my 30 years' experience at the bar I have never yet been subjected to without the privilege of holding the instigators thereof responsible, personally responsible. It is possibly my fault that I have failed oratorically to convey to the gentlemen of the jury the full force and significance of the defendant's signals. I am aware that my voice is singularly deficient in producing either the dulcet tones of my fair client or the impassioned vehemence of the defendant's response. I will," continued the Colonel, with a fatigued but blind fatuity that ignored the hurriedly knit brows and warning eyes of the judge, "try again. The note uttered by my client," lowering his voice to the faintest of falsettos, "was Kerree. The response was Kerrow," and the Colonel's voice fairly shook the dome above him. Another uproar of laughter followed this apparently audacious repetition, but was interrupted by an unlooked-for incident. The defendant rose abruptly, and, tearing himself away from the withholding hand and pleading protestations of his counsel, absolutely fled from the courtroom, his appearance outside being recognized by a prolonged "Kerrow" from the bystanders, which again and again followed him in the distance. In the momentary silence which followed, the Colonel's voice was heard saying, "We rest here, your honor," and he sat down. No less white, but more agitated, was the face of the defendant's counsel, who instantly rose. "For some unexplained reason, your honor, my client desires to suspend further proceedings with a view to effect a peaceable compromise with the plaintiff. As he is a man of wealth and position, he is able and willing to pay liberally for that privilege; while I, as his counsel, am still convinced of his legal irresponsibility, as he has chosen, however, to publicly abandon his rights here, I can only ask your honor's permission to suspend further proceedings until I can confer with Colonel Starbottle." "As far as I can follow the pleadings," said the judge gravely, "the case seems to be hardly one for litigation, and I approve the defendant's course, while I strongly urge the plaintiff to accept it." Colonel Starbottle bent over his fair client. Presently he rose, unchanged in look or demeanor. "I yield, your honor, to the wishes of my client and lady. We accept." Before the court adjourned that day, it was known throughout the town that Adoniram K. Hotchkiss had compromised the suit for $4,000 and cost. Colonel Starbottle had so far recovered his equanimity as to strut jauntily towards his office, where he was to meet his fair client. He was surprised, however, to find her already there, and in company with a somewhat sheepish-looking young man, a stranger. If the Colonel had any disappointment in meeting a third party to the interview, his old-fashioned courtesy did not permit him to show it. He bowed graciously and politely motioned them each to a seat. I reckoned I'd bring Hiram round with me," said the young lady, lifting her searching eyes, after a pause, to the Colonel's, "though he was awful shy, and allowed that you didn't know him from Adam, or even suspected his existence. But I said, 'There's just where you slip up, Hiram. A powerful man like the Colonel knows everything, and I've seen it in his eye. Lordy," she continues with a laugh, leaning forward over her parasol, as her eyes again sought the Colonel's, "don't you remember when you asked me if I loved that old Hotchkiss, and I told you that's tellin', and you looked at me? Lordy, I knew then you suspected there was a Hiram somewhere, as good as if I'd told you. Now just you get up, Hiram, and give the Colonel a good handshake. For if it wasn't for him and his searching ways, and his awful power of language, I wouldn't have got that $4,000 out of that flirty old Hotchkiss, enough to buy a farm so you and me could get married. That's what you owe to him. Don't stand there like a stuck fool staring at him. He won't eat you, though he's killed many a better man. Come, have I got to do all the kissing?" It is of record that the Colonel bowed so courteously and so profoundly that he managed not merely to evade the proffered hand of the shy Hiram, but to only lightly touch the franker and more impulsive finger–tips of the gentle Zaidee. "I offer my sincerest congratulations, though I think you overestimate my powers of penetration. Unfortunately, a pressing engagement, which may oblige me also to leave town to–night, forbids my saying more. I have left the business settlement of this case in the hands of the lawyers who do my office work, and who will show you every attention. And now let me wish you a very good afternoon." Nevertheless, the Colonel returned to his private room, and it was nearly twilight when the faithful Jim entered to find him sitting meditatively before his desk. "'Fore God, Colonel, I hope dey ain't nuffin de matter, but you's lookin' mighty solemn. I ain't seen you look dat way, Colonel, since de day poor Mars' Stryker was fetched home, shot frough de head." "Hand me down the whiskey, Jim," said the Colonel, rising slowly. The negro flew to the closet joyfully and brought out the bottle. The Colonel poured out a glass of the spirit and drank it with his old deliberation. "You're quite right, Jim," he said, putting down his glass, "but I'm getting old, and somehow I'm missing poor Stryker damnably." End of Project Gutenberg Part 2